Here's what's really happening. Somebody in Washington is lying to you right now, and the strange part is they might not even know they're doing it. Because right now, there are senators, retired generals, and television analysts all telling you the exact same thing. Iran is on its knees. America has leverage. This war is basically won. And every single one of those claims is about to run straight into a timeline that says otherwise. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why the people most confident about this war are the ones who got it the most wrong, and what that mistake is about to cost the United States in a part of the world far more important than the Persian Gulf. Stick with me, because the ending of this one is the part nobody in mainstream media wants to say out loud. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this is Zhang's Strategic Ledger, and what we do here is simple. We follow the money and the power behind the headlines because the real story is almost never the one being announced in the press conference. If that sounds like your kind of channel, hit subscribe right now before we get into the timeline, because you are going to want to see what we cover next, okay? Let's lay this out the way it actually happened, in order, because the order is the whole story. Late February, the United States opens a sustained air campaign against Iranian military infrastructure. Not a couple of strikes here and there, a real campaign, day after day for roughly 40 days. And the goal, whether stated out loud or just understood by everyone watching, was to do one of two things. Either break Iran's will to keep fighting or physically destroy its nuclear program so completely that the question became irrelevant. 40 days is a long time to run an air campaign. That's not a warning shot. That's a serious, sustained military effort with a serious objective behind it. And then, in early April, it stopped. Not because Iran surrendered, not because the nuclear program was gone. It stopped because 40 days of bombing had not produced the result Washington was looking for. So what happens next tells you everything. If the air campaign had worked, there would have been no reason to do anything else. You don't escalate a strategy that's already succeeding. But that's exactly what happened. By the middle of April, the United States shifted from the sky to the sea and implemented a naval blockade in and around Iranian waters. Now think about what a blockade actually is for a second. This isn't some symbolic gesture. A blockade is one of the most serious tools a country can use against another nation short of actually invading it. It's economic strangulation through military force. And this blockade didn't last a week or two. It ran for roughly 2 months, from the middle of April all the way to the middle of June. 2 months of pressure specifically designed to choke Iran's economy and force a capitulation at the negotiating table. And then June 17th arrives, and this is the moment that should have been a giant flashing warning sign for anyone paying close attention, because on that day, President Trump signed a memorandum of understanding with Iran. Now, here's the thing about that agreement. If you actually read what was agreed to, without the spin, without the press release language, it reads far closer to Iran's original position than anything close to what Washington had been demanding for months. This wasn't a triumphant handshake after a successful pressure campaign. This was the third tool in 3 months after the first two had already failed. And that sequence matters more than almost anything else in this story. Air power tried, and it didn't break Iran. Naval pressure tried, and it didn't break Iran either. Economic squeeze through the blockade tried, and that didn't produce capitulation. Only after all three of those failed did the United States sit down and put pen to paper on an agreement. You don't need anyone's opinion to read that sequence. You just need to look at the order events happened in. 3 different instruments of pressure used one after another, each one replacing the last because the previous one didn't work. That is not what a winning position looks like. That is what a retreat looks like when nobody wants to call it a retreat. So here's where it gets genuinely strange, because right now in Washington, you can turn on the television and hear extremely smart, extremely well-connected people insisting that none of what I just told you matters, that Iran is actually the one in trouble, that a little more pressure, a little more patience, and the real win is right around the corner. And here's the thing. These aren't dumb people. These are people with decades of experience in foreign policy, in military strategy, in Gulf security specifically. So why would educated, informed people keep saying something that the actual sequence of events seems to directly contradict? Part of it is something almost psychological. There's a strain of thinking in American foreign policy, and it's not limited to one political party that simply cannot process the idea that American military power has limits. Not because these people don't understand war. They understand war extremely well. It's because their entire professional worldview is built on the assumption that American military dominance can always, eventually, be made to work if you apply enough of it for long enough. And when something like Iran happens, the same way Afghanistan happened, the same way Iraq happened before that, it isn't just a policy setback to these people. It's a threat to the entire framework they've built their careers on. And when people are faced with something that threatens their entire framework, the natural human reaction usually isn't to revise the framework, it's to deny what's happening in front of them. But there's a second reason, and this one is less about psychology and more about plain financial incentive. Washington's entire foreign policy ecosystem, the think tanks, the retired generals who end up on corporate boards after their military careers end, the senators who chair the committees overseeing defense spending, even a lot of the journalists who cover these stories, all of it is connected, directly or indirectly, to the maintenance of American military primacy as a kind of permanent fact of life. There are real careers, real consulting contracts, real defense industry relationships built entirely around the idea that American power in the world keeps expanding, or at the very least, never visibly contracts. So when you ask that entire ecosystem to accept that a war went badly, you're not just asking them to update an opinion. You're asking them to admit that the foundation of their professional life might be cracking. That is an extremely difficult thing for anyone to admit, regardless of how smart they are. So when you hear voices insisting that Iran has to dismantle its missile program completely, that all of its regional proxies need to be eliminated, that the United States needs to guarantee total freedom of navigation through the strait on its own terms, what you are actually listening to is not a strategy. It's a wish list. And a wish list dressed up to sound like a strategy is genuinely one of the most dangerous things in foreign policy because it convinces decision makers that more pressure will eventually produce a result that the facts on the ground say is no longer realistic. Now let's get specific because this next part is where the abstract turns into something you can actually picture, the Strait of Hormuz. If you don't follow energy markets closely, here's what you need to know. Something close to 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply passes through that single stretch of water. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, all of them depend on that strait for the revenue that keeps their economies running. And on the other side of the world, China, Japan, and South Korea depend on that same strait for the energy that keeps their economies running too. Whoever can credibly threaten that passage holds a lever that doesn't just affect one country. It affects the entire architecture of global trade. And Iran sits directly on that geography. For years, honestly for decades, Iran has been quietly building exactly the kind of military capability that exploits that location. Naval mines, fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, drones. None of this is flashy. None of it shows up in a Pentagon budget presentation as the exciting next-generation weapons system. But it is precisely the kind of low-cost, high-impact capability that makes the Strait an extremely costly place for anyone trying to contest Iranian influence there. So what we've seen over the past few days, the strikes, the missile exchanges, this isn't some brand new crisis appearing out of nowhere. It's a continuation of a negotiating dynamic that's been running since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed. Iran is making a point, and the point is simple. The Strait now operates on Iranian terms. Commercial shipping wanting safe passage comes to Iran first, rather than assuming American naval power automatically guarantees open access the way it used to. That assumption, the one the entire region operated on for decades, is no longer something either side is taking for granted. Now here's where the story gets, honestly, almost tragic in its irony, and it's the part of this whole situation that deserves way more attention than it's getting. The nuclear question. A huge part of the justification for going to war with Iran in the first place was the nuclear program. The argument from serious analysts inside Washington was, Iran is approaching a nuclear threshold, and once it crosses that threshold, everything in the region changes permanently. Israel becomes vulnerable in a completely new way. Saudi Arabia and potentially Turkey and Egypt start seriously considering their own nuclear paths. The entire non-proliferation structure for that part of the world essentially collapses. So the logic in Washington was, better to strike now while Iran is still just a threshold state, rather than wait until it's already a declared nuclear power. Here's the problem. That air campaign, the 40 days we talked about earlier, it degraded Iran's nuclear program. It did not destroy it. Underground hardened facilities survive bombing campaigns in a way that surface-level infrastructure simply doesn't. And Iran knew this. Iran had spent years anticipating exactly this scenario and had dispersed and hardened its most critical nuclear sites specifically to survive something like this. So after everything, the program is damaged, but it's still there. And Iran's motivation to finish that program, to cross the threshold completely and make itself immune to this kind of attack happening again in the future, is now stronger than it has ever been at any point in this entire conflict. Sit with that for a second, because that is the paradox sitting at the center of the entire American strategy here. The attempt to stop Iran from going nuclear has now given Iran every possible incentive to finish the job as fast as it possibly can. And that's going to make the next round of negotiations genuinely difficult, because Iran is going to walk into that room holding the nuclear card as something real, not theoretical. A program that's closer to completion than when this entire war started, a demonstrated willingness to absorb serious punishment rather than give in, and full knowledge, because the American side has already shown its hand, that there's no credible military threat left to back up any future ultimatum. The air campaign didn't work. The blockade didn't work. A ground invasion was never seriously on the table, for reasons that should be obvious to anyone who thinks through the logistics and the domestic political cost for whoever attempted it. So now zoom out with me for a second, because this story is actually about something much bigger than just Iran, and this is where I think most of the commentary out there is missing the real point entirely. For roughly 30 years, from the end of the Cold War up until somewhere around 2017 or so, the United States operated in something close to a truly unipolar world. Not just the strongest country, the only real great power, structurally speaking. China was still rising but hadn't fully arrived yet. Russia was diminished and largely focused inward. Europe was comfortable and content under the American security umbrella. And in that kind of world, Washington could pursue an extremely ambitious version of global order with a level of confidence that, looking back, probably wasn't always fully earned, but was at least grounded in something real. That world doesn't exist anymore. What we live in now is a multipolar world, and multipolar worlds are messier by definition. China is now a genuine great power with global reach and global ambition. Russia, regardless of its struggles, remains a nuclear power with real influence over European security. And regional powers, Iran, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, have all developed the ability to resist outside pressure in ways they simply couldn't 20 years ago. The United States still has enormous power. Nobody's disputing that. But it now has to operate in an environment without the structural advantages it used to take for granted. And here's why that matters specifically because of this war. The most important long-term competition for the United States isn't in the Persian Gulf. It's in East Asia, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the security of Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Any rational prioritization of American strategic interests should be putting the majority of attention and resources there. But the Iran war pulled real resources away from exactly that priority. By some accounts, it used up a significant portion of America's precision munitions stockpile. It pulled air defense systems out of Japan and South Korea and moved them to the Middle East. It repositioned naval assets that had specifically been part of the Pacific deterrence posture. And all of this happened while China was watching incredibly closely. What did Beijing actually observe during this entire war? It observed that the United States couldn't sustain a 40-day air campaign against a single regional power to the point of achieving its own stated goals. It observed that American base infrastructure in the Gulf, infrastructure that was supposedly hardened and protected, was vulnerable enough to Iranian missiles that American personnel had to be moved out of bases and into civilian hotels for safety. And it observed that the political will to keep the conflict going was limited by domestic economic pressure and by a country that is frankly exhausted after being involved in some form of conflict for most of the past quarter century. None of that is good news if you're thinking about deterrence in East Asia. If you're sitting in Beijing looking at Taiwan, the Iran experience doesn't tell you American power is untouchable. It tells you something close to the opposite. And that creates a genuinely difficult position for American strategists, because on one hand, there's now arguably the strongest argument in decades for fundamentally shifting American attention and resources away from the Middle East and toward the Pacific. But on the other hand, the Iran war has already burned through resources and political capital and munitions that would have been incredibly useful in any future East Asia scenario. So when that pivot finally happens, and there's a real argument it will happen, it'll be happening from a weaker starting position than if this war had never been fought in the first place. There's actually a useful historical comparison here. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, when it became completely undeniable that the American effort in Vietnam had failed, the United States did something very human. It turned away. It didn't want to think about Southeast Asia anymore. And for roughly a decade afterward, American strategic attention shifted hard toward Europe, toward NATO, toward the nuclear balance with the Soviet Union. There's a real case that something similar happens here. The last thing any American administration wants after this experience is another extended conflict in the Persian Gulf. So East Asia becomes the next place where American attention concentrates, partly because the strategic logic genuinely points there, and partly just because of the very human need to find somewhere else to reassert strength after what just happened in the Gulf. And now, let's talk about the part of this story that almost nobody wants to bring up because it's the least exciting and probably the most important. The money. The United States is currently running annual deficits of roughly $2 trillion. Total national debt is approaching, and by some measures has already reached, the size of the entire American economy in a single year. The country is spending somewhere around $1 trillion a year just on interest payments before a single dollar goes toward anything else. These are not small, abstract numbers. They represent a real and tightening constraint on what the United States can actually afford to do in the world, regardless of what anyone in Washington wants to be true. And on top of that fiscal pressure, this war exposed something uncomfortable about America's defense industrial base. It couldn't keep pace with the demand for precision munitions required to sustain even this one extended air campaign. Not a multi-front world war, one regional conflict. That tells you something important about the gap between America's stated military ambitions and its actual current industrial capacity to support them. So when you hear people in Washington insisting that the answer is simply more pressure, hold the line, don't legitimize anything Iran is asking for, what you're actually hearing is a talking point, not a strategy. Because applying more pressure requires having more pressure left to apply. And this war just demonstrated in real time, in front of the entire world, exactly how much pressure the United States actually had left in the tank and what happened when it ran out. So where does that leave things? The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on the entire planet, is now operating under conditions that Iran has real influence over in a way it simply didn't before this war started. The nuclear program that this entire war was partly justified around is still standing and arguably more motivated to finish than at any point before the bombing started. And the American military position in the Gulf has been shown to the entire world, allies and rivals alike, to be far more vulnerable than anyone advertised going in. This isn't really a story about who won and who lost a single confrontation in the Persian Gulf. It's a story about what happens when a country built an entire foreign policy tradition around the assumption that military power alone can permanently solve political problems and then runs directly into a country that spent decades preparing specifically to prove that assumption wrong. And the next chapter of this, the one almost nobody is talking about yet, is what happens when the country watching all of this most carefully isn't in the Middle East at all. It's much further east, and it's taking very careful notes. If this kind of breakdown is the reason you keep coming back to this channel, let me know in the comments what part of this story you think the mainstream coverage is getting wrong, because I read through every single one of them, and some of the best ideas for future videos on this channel have come straight from that comment section. And if you know somebody who's been following this story but keeps getting fed the version where America simply won, send them this video, because the timeline alone tells a very different story than the headlines do. Before you go, hit subscribe if you haven't already, because we're going to be tracking exactly what happens next with Iran's nuclear program, and exactly how this entire situation reshapes what happens next in the Pacific, and you're going to want to see that one when it drops. Thanks for watching Jiang Strategic Ledger. I'll see you in the next one.